Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I tried masking fluid for the first time in a dreamy, summer-inspired study. This is a look at what went well, what didn't, and what I plan to do next time. Let's get started. The supplies I used include Arches cold-press watercolor paper, a generic plastic mixing palette, a Derwent pencil extender, and Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils in emerald and burnt ochre, Schminke masking fluid, the Daniel Smith's Watercolor Essentials set, sizes 6 and 12 Sable hair brushes, and Pebeo Studio Gouache in permanent white. If you want to skip straight to the study, I've left timestamps in the description along with other pertinent info. I wanted to do a test first since this is my first time using masking fluid, liquid frisket, or that thing I've heard both great things and horror stories about. I bought the Schminke fluid because it came with an applicator, though I quickly realized I was going to need other ways to apply the liquid itself. After a roughly 20-minute dry time, the wash of phthalo blue applied cleanly without reactivating the masking fluid. When this wash was also dry, I was able to peel the fluid off with a normal eraser, revealing crisp lines beneath and undamaged paper. I went into the study with confidence from this initial test. After transferring my line work with the Polychromos pencils, I blocked out the brightest highlights, which I wanted to stay the white of the paper, with the masking fluid. Once the fluid was dry, I laid down a layer of water, then dropped in paint to establish the color composition and second lightest highlight colors. I love this step because it lets me create soft, dreamy gradients that help unify everything in the study. It was a joy to be able to do this without worrying about the bright whites this time. After this layer, it was time for, more masking fluid. Some people might reserve masking fluid for small details or areas in their first attempt at using it. Other people jump into the deep end and hope they can swim. Luckily for me, things went well with the second wash. Mostly. Hard edges formed along the bottom of her dress since I didn't want the green to creep into the actual fabric. I didn't panic because I knew I would have time later on to soften this line with grass texture and glazing. You may have noticed I kept most of the color on the bottom half of the study with this wash. This is to create atmospheric perspective and a sense of depth. As things move farther away in space, the contrast and values lessen. In the reference photo, this effect was amped up by filters, and I wanted to preserve this in my actual study. Then it was time to actually start rendering the figure. I removed the top portion of the masking fluid to make sure it didn't damage the paper first, then started painting again. Sometimes I do this first, other times I wait. It depends on the background, what colors and values are present, and honestly my mood most of the time. This day I started with the dress, then moved my way out into the skin using light, delicate washes. In my thumbnails, I used more red and blue in these shadows. I wish I'd done this on the final, but alas, I stuck to neutral tones. I might have been influenced by the desaturated background looking back at it now. Once everything was dry again, I added more masking fluid. Look, I was excited by the new tool I had to play with, and despite what this looks like, there was actually a plan. I wanted to create layers of foliage and flowers using value. By staggering my masking fluid layers, I hoped I could capture a gradient as each watercolor wash got darker. Unfortunately, this did mean I doubled or even tripled my dry time. Instead of just waiting for watercolor layers to dry, I had to wait for masking fluid layers and watercolor layers to dry. At least the painting times were shorter. Since I wasn't as worried about edge control, I could be looser with my brush strokes. At this point, I decided to place the study at an angle. It's easier to film flat, but I actually prefer working on angles. 1 for my back, and 2 to get a better idea of what things actually look like. I continued working on the figure by deepening the shadows and then glazing warmth back into her skin. Once she was dry, I removed some of the masking fluid before continuing. When I first used this masking fluid, I thought the blue color was clever, but I realized during the thumbnail stage that it was skewing my values. The blue is such a deep, saturated color that I ended up painting the values around it darker than I actually wanted them. To counteract this, I decided to gradually remove the masking fluid, starting at the top and moving downwards. This meant I had to be careful around those bright whites again, but I decided the trade-off was worth it if I could get an accurate look at my value structure. Then it was time for the details. I finally let myself focus on one little area instead of the overall painting. It was difficult to render this small, and I cursed my past self for keeping the study 5 by 7 inches. But hey, at least it let me practice brush control. I eventually gave in and broke out the white gouache. Part of me was annoyed that I still needed it, but the rest of me reminded that part how difficult it had been to get small, precise details with the masking fluid. Flowers didn't need to be wholly accurate, but facial features do. If I had tried to preserve the highlights on this scale, I likely would have driven myself mad. Besides, the gouache added to the hazy, dreamy look. The final step was finishing up the background. The flowers reminded me of tiny sunny-side-up eggs, which made me laugh more times than it probably should have. Part of me, you know the part that likes to self-sabotage, wanted me to detail each petal and every flower in the foreground, but luckily it lost the fight. These flowers aren't the focal point, so unnecessary rendering would only distract the viewer from the figure. Instead, I used blue to render out the overall form shadows, then let things be. Here's the final study. It's not my most detailed, but I like it because it captured the mood I was after. I'm also relieved that the masking fluid didn't decide to betray me at any point by ripping the paper or staining anything. In the future, I'll probably reserve it for the first layers just to avoid the prolonged drying times. But I'm happy I can add this tool to my toolbox of techniques. Anyway, as always, I hope you created something that brought you joy this week, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!